Madness Behind the Mask. Prologue. Renowned psychiatrist Dr. James Cartwright always prided himself on his ability to delve deep into the human mind. His office, located in an old building on Park Street, with its heavy wooden paneling and shelves full of medical books, exuded an atmosphere of reliability and professionalism. He had seen many patients here, helping them deal with their inner demons. One autumn day, when the streets of London were enveloped in a crisp chill, James received an unusual letter. It was from Michael Harper, a man he had never heard of before. The letter was written in neat handwriting and contained a plea for an urgent consultation. "I need your help, Dr. Cartwright. I feel like I am losing myself," the last line read. James, a man inclined to compassion, could not ignore such a cry for help. He scheduled an appointment for the next day, unaware that this patient would turn his life upside down. Chapter 1. The New Patient. Dr. James Cartwright glanced at the clock. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. He pulled the letter from his jacket pocket and read it once more. Michael Harper. What could have brought him to such a state? As he pondered this, he suddenly heard a soft knock on the door. "Come in," James said, putting the letter back in his pocket. The door slowly opened, and a tall man in his mid-40s entered the office. His face was calm, but his eyes sparkled with a sharp intellect and concealed anxiety. Michael Harper looked as if he had been preparing for this meeting his entire life. "Good morning, Dr. Cartwright," Michael said with a slight smile. "Thank you for seeing me." "Good morning, Mr. Harper. Please have a seat," James replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Michael sat down and leaned back in the chair, watching the doctor intently. James felt a slight unease, as if under the patient's penetrating gaze, his thoughts became transparent. "What brings you to me?" James began, trying to regain control of the situation. "Doctor, I have a problem," Michael started, leaning forward slightly. "I feel like I am losing control over my mind. It all started a few months ago when I began to notice strange changes in my behavior. I started forgetting things, seeing things that weren't there, and most frighteningly, hearing voices." James made a note in his notepad, not taking his eyes off Michael. "Voices? Can you describe them?" he asked, trying to understand the nature of the problem. "They talk to me as if they know all my thoughts and fears," Michael continued. "Sometimes they tell me things I could never know on my own. It's terrifying, doctor. I don't know where my thoughts end and theirs begin." Dr. Cartwright nodded, sinking deeper into the patient's story. Every time Michael spoke, it felt like he knew more than he was letting on. Inside, James felt a growing sense of unease, but he quickly suppressed it, continuing to ask questions and make notes. Michael Harper turned out to be the most mysterious and disturbing patient in his practice. There was something strange and elusive about him, but James was determined to get to the bottom of it. He had no idea that this meeting would be the beginning of a dangerous game, where the stakes were higher than he could ever imagine. Chapter 2. Mind Games. Dr. James Cartwright couldn't get the first meeting with Michael Harper out of his head. Every word spoken by this enigmatic patient seemed laden with hidden meaning. With each session, James felt his own perception of reality beginning to blur. At the second session, Michael appeared even more calm and confident. James noticed that the patient had become more open, describing his visions and voices with startling detail. "Doctor," Michael began, comfortably settled in the chair, "have you ever considered that reality might just be an illusion? What if our thoughts and feelings are merely tricks of the mind?" James nodded, making another note in his notebook. "That's an interesting perspective, Michael. Are you saying you don't trust your own perceptions?" "Exactly," Michael continued, his eyes gleaming in the dim light of the office. "Sometimes I feel like someone or something is trying to manipulate me. These voices, they seem to know my deepest fears and use them against me." James pondered the patient's words. Was this a manifestation of schizophrenia or something more complex? His professional pride demanded he find an answer, but with each session, it became increasingly difficult to separate professional interest from personal feelings. "Michael," James said, trying to maintain a calm tone, "you mentioned that the voices sometimes tell you things you couldn't know on your own. Can you give an example?" Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming low and conspiratorial. "A few days ago, they told me about you, Doctor. They told me you have a secret, one that you keep even from your wife." James tensed but tried not to show his emotions. How could this man know about his personal problems? Was it just a coincidence, or did Michael truly possess some extraordinary ability? "That's curious," James replied, attempting to steer the conversation back to professional territory. "But let's return to you, Michael. What else can you tell me about your visions?" Michael relaxed again and continued to recount his strange visions and voices, but James could no longer listen with the same detachment. Thoughts swirled in his mind about how deep Michael's game ran and what role he himself played in it. After the session, James felt exhausted, as if he had undergone a psychological trial himself. He sat in his office, staring at the empty chair across from him, and suddenly realized he was beginning to doubt his own sanity. Michael Harper was not just a patient. He was a challenge that demanded answers to questions James didn't even know how to ask. Chapter 3: Breaking Boundaries. Several weeks had passed since Dr. James Cartwright began therapy with Michael Harper. With each session, James's anxiety and doubts about his own sanity only grew. Michael skillfully manipulated their conversations, leaving behind a sense of deep unease and uncertainty. Elizabeth, James's wife, also started noticing changes in her husband's behavior. She observed how he became increasingly withdrawn and lost in thought. One evening, as James sat in his study, immersed in his work, Elizabeth decided to talk to him. "James, what's happening to you?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "You're not yourself anymore. You've changed." James looked up from his notes and met his wife's concerned gaze. In her eyes, he saw worry and love, but it was difficult for him to explain what was happening. "Liz, I don't know," he replied quietly. "This patient, he's doing something to me. I feel like I'm losing control of the situation." Elizabeth moved closer and took his hand. "You need to find a way to handle this, James. You can't let one patient destroy you." James nodded, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just Michael. There was something about this man that was so strong and mysterious, it undermined his confidence in his professional abilities. At the next session, Michael appeared with a smile on his face, as if nothing had happened. He looked relaxed and even slightly amused, which only intensified James's anxiety. "Doctor," Michael began, settling comfortably in the chair, "have you ever wondered what it means to lose oneself? What if your self isn't as solid as you think?" James mustered all his courage and asked, "Michael, what are you trying to do? Why do you keep playing these games?" Michael leaned forward, and something dark and dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I'm not playing, Doctor. I'm just showing you what you don't want to see." At that moment, James felt the room start to spin around him. He barely managed to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. His head swam, and spots danced before his eyes. Suddenly, he heard Michael's quiet voice. "You can't escape the truth, Doctor. It will always follow you." James gathered all his strength to steady his breathing and regain control. But it became clear to him that Michael was playing by his own rules, and those rules did not follow ordinary logic. After the session, James was once again alone in his office. He sat in silence, feeling his mind slowly disintegrate under a pressure he couldn't explain. At some point, he realized he wouldn't be able to handle this alone. Chapter 4: Meeting the Detective. James understood that he couldn't handle Michael alone. He decided to seek help from his old friend, Detective Mark Roberts. Mark was not only a professional in his field but also someone James could trust. One evening, After another unsettling session with Michael, James called Mark and asked for a meeting. They arranged to meet at a small cafe on the corner. When James walked in, he saw Mark sitting at a table by the window. "James, good to see you," Mark said, standing up and shaking his friend's hand. "You look terrible. What's going on?" James sighed and sat down opposite the detective. "Mark, I'm in serious trouble. I have a patient who is literally driving me insane. I can't figure out what he's doing, but his manipulations are breaking my ability to think clearly." Mark listened intently, not interrupting. He knew his friend was always composed and professional, so his words couldn't be an exaggeration. "Tell me everything from the beginning," Mark said when James paused. James began recounting his encounters with Michael Harper, describing his strange statements and manipulations. He explained how Michael seemed to know too much about him, as if reading his thoughts and using them against him. "That sounds very strange," Mark said when James finished. "Are you sure he's not just a very good actor or a fraud?" "I don't know, Mark. I've tried to find a rational explanation, but the more I try, the more confused I get," James admitted. "I think I need your help to figure this out." Mark nodded, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "All right, James. I'll help you. But first, we need to gather as much information as we can about Michael Harper. I'll look into his past and see what kind of person we're dealing with." James felt a sense of relief. He was no longer alone in this fight. Now he had a trusted ally who could help him regain control of the situation. After their meeting, James returned home with renewed hope. Elizabeth noticed that he seemed a bit calmer, and this reassured her. "Mark will help you," she said, embracing her husband. "You're not alone." James nodded, feeling the warmth of his wife's support. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but now he had a plan and the backing of his loved ones. Chapter 5. Revelations. The next morning, Mark Roberts began his investigation. He delved into all available data about Michael Harper. Official documents, social media, old records, nothing escaped his attention. Each new fact added another piece to the overall picture, but this picture became increasingly convoluted. Meanwhile, James continued his sessions with Michael. This time, he felt a bit more confident, knowing that Mark was working on unraveling the mystery. But each new session brought new riddles and doubts. Michael seemed to know all of James's weaknesses and skillfully exploited them. "Doctor," Michael began, comfortably settled in the chair, "have you ever wondered why people fear the truth? Sometimes the truth is so terrifying that it's easier to live in illusion." James looked at him, trying to understand where this conversation was leading. "What are you trying to say, Michael?" "I'm saying that everything you know about yourself might be an illusion created by your own mind. And what if I told you that you're no longer able to control your reality?" Michael's words sounded like a verdict. James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew Michael was playing with him, but he couldn't grasp the game's rules. At that moment, Dr. Emily Norton, James's colleague and loyal assistant, entered the office. She sensed the tension in the air and immediately understood that the conversation had gone too far. "Excuse me for interrupting," she said, addressing James. "But we have an urgent matter that requires your attention." James nodded, understanding that Emily was trying to save him. He stood up and turned to Michael. "We will continue our conversation next time. Thank you for your time." Michael just smiled, and his eyes gleamed with a cold light. When James and Emily left the office, she turned to him and quietly said, "James, I see you're on the edge. We need to figure this out together. I'm ready to help you." James felt gratitude for Emily's support. He knew he couldn't handle this alone. Together, they began analyzing Michael's behavior and searching for ways to expose him. Meanwhile, Mark Roberts continued to dig deeper. Soon, he discovered something astonishing. Michael Harper had connections to a secret organization that studied psychological manipulation. This explained his knowledge of methods and extraordinary abilities. Mark decided to inform James immediately. That evening, they met at the same cafe to discuss the new revelations. "James, I found something important," Mark said, sitting down at the table. "Michael is linked to an organization that conducts psychological experiments. This could explain his behavior." James felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to come together. Now he understood that Michael was not just a patient but part of a much more complex game. "We need to proceed cautiously," James said. "Michael is dangerous, and we don't know what he's capable of." Mark nodded, agreeing with his friend. "We'll work together to expose him and find a way to stop his manipulations." "I'm with you, James." Now James and Mark had a plan. They decided to use Mark's knowledge about Michael to develop a strategy and expose him. Ahead lay a dangerous game, but they were determined to win. Chapter 6: Confrontation. James and Mark understood that every step they took had to be meticulously planned. They developed a strategy to expose Michael and prove his manipulations. James knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to fight for his life and career. On the appointed day, James invited Michael for another session. But this time, things were different. The office was equipped with hidden cameras, and Mark and Emily watched from a neighboring room. James felt like he was on stage, every move scrutinized by the audience. Michael entered the office as usual, calm and confident. He sat in the chair and smiled at James. "Doctor, how are you feeling?" he asked with a slight hint of mockery in his voice. "Thank you, Michael. Today, I wanted to discuss something important with you," James began, trying to maintain his composure. "Of course, Doctor. What's on your mind?" James picked up a folder of documents that Mark had prepared and began. "Michael, I've studied your case and found some anomalies. Are you aware that your manipulation techniques are well known in certain circles?" Michael raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "You're connected to an organization that conducts psychological experiments. This explains your ability to influence people and use their weaknesses against them." Michael quietly laughed. "Doctor, do you really think you can expose me?" he asked, his voice turning cold and harsh. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." At that moment, the office door swung open, and Mark entered with a group of police officers. "Michael Harper, you're under arrest for illegal psychological experiments and manipulation," Mark announced, approaching Michael. Michael didn't resist, but his gaze remained cold and confident. "You won't prove anything," he said as they escorted him out of the office. "This game isn't over." When the door closed behind Michael, James felt the tension drain from his body. He sat down at his desk and exhaled deeply. Emily approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, James. It's over." But James knew that, in reality, it was only the beginning. Now he had to deal with the consequences of everything that had happened. He knew that a long road lay ahead in restoring his mind and career, but he was ready for it. Mark approached and smiled. "You did the right thing, James. We'll get through this together." James nodded, feeling the support of his friends. He knew that with their help, he could overcome any obstacles. Epilogue. Several months had passed since Michael Harper's arrest. James Cartwright's life was slowly returning to normal. At first, it was difficult for him to regain confidence in himself and his profession, but the support of friends and colleagues helped him overcome his inner demons. Elizabeth and Emily were his main pillars during this challenging time. Elizabeth supported him at home, creating a cozy and warm environment that aided his recovery. Emily, on the other hand, stood by him at work, helping him handle professional duties and gradually regain his lost ground. Mark Roberts continued to monitor Michael's case. Soon, it became clear that Michael was just a part of a much larger and more dangerous organization. His arrest led to the uncovering of a network of manipulators who used psychological methods to achieve their goals. This discovery was a significant step in the fight against psychological terrorism. James knew that the path to complete recovery would be long, but he was ready for it. Now he understood that strength lay not only in knowledge and professional skills but also in the support of loved ones. One evening, as he and Elizabeth sat in the living room enjoying the peace, James looked at his wife and smiled. "Thank you, Liz. I couldn't have done it without you." Elizabeth smiled back and hugged him tightly. "You did it, James. You're strong, and I'll always be here for you." These words warmed his soul. He knew that together they could overcome any difficulties. Now he was ready to return to his work with renewed energy and confidence. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.